The planet hit her like a fist. One moment Diana of Themyscira had been standing at the edge of a collapsing dimensional rift above the Aegean Sea. The next, she was falling through a bruised purple sky at terminal velocity. The stars above her wrong in every possible way. No constellation she had ever mapped. No familiar pull of Earth's gravity in the precise way her body had. Memorized over a century of flight. The air tasted of sulfur and iron, thick with industrial smoke that rose in black. Columns from forged cities sprawling across a landscape that looked carved, rather than built, jagged black mountains. Rivers the color of cooling metal, and a sky perpetually threatening a storm it never quite delivered. She hit the ground, outside the city limits of the first city of Kyonos at approximately the speed of a falling meteor. The crater she left was 12 feet across. Diana rose from it slowly, shaking pulverized rock from her dark hair, her golden armor catching the dull red light of a sun that felt older and angrier than soul. Her bracers hummed faintly. They had activated on instinct during the fall, crossed against the impact, and her lasso still burned at her hip with its familiar warm light. Steady and patient as always, she took 3 measured breaths, assessed the dimensional rift that had swallowed her was gone. No residual energy signature, no obvious path back. She had been in worse situations. The Klingon found her in under 4 minutes. 12 warriors on foot, with 2 more riding what she could only describe as scaled riding. Beasts that moved like cavalry horses, bred for war rather than beauty. They were enormous, most standing at or above her own height, which was itself considerable, wearing layered armor of dark metal and leather, their foreheads ridged, their expressions cycling through surprise, aggression, and something that looked almost like professional curiosity. They carried weapons she didn't recognize, curved blades of elaborate design, and shorter devices that hummed with directed energy. The leader, she identified, him by posture and the deference. The others angled toward him without realizing, pointed one of the energy weapons directly at her face and said something in a language that rolled and crashed like boulders down a mountain. Diana kept her hands visible and open. "I don't understand your language," she said clearly, in the measured tone she used when entering hostile territory for the first time. "But I am not your enemy. I am Diana, Princess of Themyscira. I arrived here without intention. I mean no harm to your people." The leader stared at her for a long moment. Then he fired. The disruptor blast hit her bracers. She had raised them on pure reflex and discharged in a cascade of green-white energy that scattered across the crater floor. The impact rocked her back half a step. It stung. Not the way human weapons stung, but genuinely stung. The way a lightning bolt from a lesser god might. Interesting. These people's weapons carried real force. She lowered her arms, met the leader's eyes. "I would prefer," she said calmly, "that we not do that again." The warriors exchanged glances. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw like a signature, did not lower his weapon, but he also did not fire a second time. He was, she realized, thinking, calculating. She had deflected a point-blank disruptor blast with 2 metal bracelets, risen from a crater that should have killed anything biological, and responded not with aggression but with measured words. Whatever category he had prepared for her, she didn't fit it. He spoke again, shorter this time. A command or a question. "I genuinely cannot understand you," she said. "But if you intend to take me somewhere, I will come willingly. I have questions of my own." They bound her wrists with heavy magnetic restraints. She allowed it, testing their strength with 20% of her actual capability and finding they would hold a human being effortlessly but would barely inconvenience her if she chose otherwise, and marched her toward the first city as the red sun climbed higher and the forge smoke thickened around them. She used the walk to study everything. The architecture was built for permanence and intimidation simultaneously. Heavy stone and dark metal. Every surface carved with imagery of warriors, battles, hunts, and ceremonies she couldn't yet interpret. The citizens who watched her pass ran a complex spectrum of reactions. Open hostility, wary curiosity, predatory assessment, and in the eyes of a few younger warriors near a training compound, something that looked remarkably like awe. Children, smaller, ridged, loud, scattered and regrouped behind their parents to stare. A trio of elderly warriors in ceremonial robes watched her procession from a stone archway with expressions she recognized from her years of diplomatic work. Powerful people recalibrating their assumptions in real time. This was a warrior culture. That much was immediate and obvious. But it was also something more. Something layered beneath it. Aggression like a foundation. She hadn't yet seen the shape of. Honor, she suspected. Not the hollow word people use to justify violence, but something structural. Something these people built their lives. Inside of the way humans built their lives. Inside of language. She would need to understand it quickly. The High Council chamber was an hour's march into the city's heart, and she memorized every step of the route. If you want to see more characters enter extraordinary new galaxies, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd love to see face an impossible world in the comments below. May the Force and honor be with you. The chamber doors were 40 feet tall, black iron, carved with an emblem she had already seen repeated across a dozen surfaces during the march. A stylized bird of prey, wings spread, talons forward. A symbol of power and descent simultaneously, something that hunted from above. Diana filed that away as the doors ground open and she was marched forward into the most dangerous room on the planet. The High Council chamber smelled like old blood and burning candles. Not metaphorically. The massive torches lining the walls burned with a dark amber flame that produced genuine smoke. And the stone floor beneath Diana's boots carried the deep, permanent stain of violence repeated over centuries. The chamber was vast, built to make every person standing in its center feel appropriately small, with tiered seating rising on both sides where council members in elaborate ceremonial armor watched her arrival with the focused attention of predators observing something they hadn't yet classified. There were perhaps 30 of them. Each one carried a weapon visibly. None of them were pretending this was a peaceful institution. At the far end, elevated on a dais of dark stone, sat the Chancellor. He was older than most in the room but carried his age the way a mountain carries weather, as something that had tested him repeatedly and lost every time. His ceremonial armor was heavier than the others, layered with emblems of office, and his eyes tracked Diana's approach with an intelligence that reminded her uncomfortably of certain Olympian gods she had negotiated with, vast, patient, and entirely accustomed to being the most dangerous mind in any given room. The warrior who had captured her, she had begun thinking of him as the Scar. For efficiency, stepped forward and delivered what was clearly a report. The chamber listened. Several council members leaned toward each other with murmured exchanges. One, a heavy-set woman in the third tier, whose armor bore more battle markings than anyone else in the room, stared at Diana with an expression of pure professional evaluation, the way Diana herself might assess a new opponent before combat. The Chancellor spoke. A translator drone, small, hovering, clearly technological, rather than biological, drifted forward from somewhere near the dais and positioned itself at Diana's shoulder level. The voice that emerged from it was flat and slightly delayed, but functional. You are brought before the High Council of the Klingon Empire. The drone rendered. You arrived without authorization on the Klingon homeworld. You deflected a disruptor blast. You are either a weapon of the Federation or something considerably stranger. Chancellor Martok wishes to know which. Diana faced the Chancellor directly, because looking away from the most powerful person in a room was a form of disrespect she had learned to avoid regardless of culture. I am neither, she said, letting the drone translate in its mechanical delay. My name is Diana of Themyscira. I am a warrior and an ambassador from a world called Earth, though not the Earth your Federation knows. If I understand correctly what I've been able to piece together from your technology and your people's reactions, I arrived here through a dimensional accident. I intend no aggression toward the Klingon Empire. I ask only for information that might help me find a path home. Silence. Then the council erupted. The translator drone did its best, but the overlapping voices defeated it. She caught fragments. Weapon, Federation spy. Demon, impossible, kill it. Test it, and underneath all of it, the structural sound of an institution that was not entirely unified. The disagreements weren't random. They had shape. Certain council members deferred to certain others, and the fault lines between those groups were visible if you knew how to read a room. And Diana had been reading rooms since. Before most of these peoples, civilizations had developed. Written language. The Chancellor raised one hand. Silence fell with the totality of long practice. A warrior, Martok repeated through the drone, his eyes steady on hers. You claim to be a warrior. You deflected a disruptor with your wrists. You survived a fall that would have killed any human being. These are not the abilities of a diplomat or a spy. He leaned forward slightly. They are the abilities of someone worth fighting. She understood what was coming before he finished speaking. There is one way. The Chancellor said that a being of unknown origin and unverified intention earns the right to speak. Before this council, you will face a champion in open combat. You will fight with honor, without concealed weapons beyond what you carry visibly, and without retreat. If you survive, your words will be heard. If you do not, he let the silence complete the sentence with the Klingon. Efficiency she was beginning to respect. Diana looked around the chamber. Every face, every posture, every warrior waiting to see what she would do. She reached up and removed the magnetic restraints from her wrists, not dramatically, not with a show of force, simply because they were no longer useful. And it seemed dishonest to stand before a council, claiming to be a warrior while wearing chains she had chosen to wear. The metal fell to the stone floor with a sound like a punctuation mark. I accept, she said. The combat arena was beneath the council chamber, accessible through a stone corridor that descended in a long spiral. It smelled of sweat and old fire and the particular sharp scent of adrenaline metabolized over centuries of repeated use. The walls were lined with weapons, bladed, mostly, of extraordinary variety and craftsmanship. Diana studied them as she passed, identifying design philosophies. These were weapons built for warriors who intended to win, not to impress. Functional, brutal, elegant in the way that things designed purely for purpose sometimes become elegant by accident. Her opponent was already waiting. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a build that suggested he had been constructed for war rather than born into it. And he carried a batleth, the curved, double-ended blade she had seen on the chamber walls in carved relief, with the unconscious ease of someone who had been practicing with it since childhood. His name, a warrior near the arena entrance told her through the drone's translation, was Karath, and he had served as council champion for 6 years without defeat. He looked at her the way serious fighters looked at serious opponents, not with contempt, but with the focused respect of someone who intended to give everything they had and expected the same in return. Diana drew no weapon. She had her bracers, her lasso, and a century and a half of combat experience against gods, monsters, and armies. Karath moved first, faster than she had expected for his size, the batleth sweeping in a lateral arc aimed at her midsection with the precision of someone who had made that exact cut 10,000 times in practice. She stepped inside it, let the blade pass within inches of her armor, and redirected his momentum with a palm strike to his shoulder that sent him stumbling sideways but did not drop him. Good. She hadn't wanted to drop him. He recovered with impressive speed, reassessed, and came at her differently, a faint high, cut low, following through, with a shoulder charge that would have shattered a human ribcage against the arena wall. She caught him instead, one hand on his armor's collar, pivoted, and used his own force to redirect him into a controlled stop rather than a collision. He looked up at her from a position of mechanical disadvantage, her grip still firm, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. Not fear, recognition. She released him and stepped back, gave him room. He stood slowly, looked at her with the batleth loose at his side. Then he did something that, from context and the sound of the arena observer's reaction, she understood was not a common occurrence. He inclined his head. She inclined hers in return. Above them, through the stone ceiling, she could feel the chamber's attention like a physical weight. Something had just happened that would need to be explained. Diana had not defeated Karath, she had declined to, and made that choice visible, and in doing so had communicated something to everyone watching that a straightforward victory never could have. She turned toward the corridor that led back to the council, and walked toward it without waiting to be escorted. She had earned her audience. The council chamber felt different when she walked back into it. not smaller, nothing. About the vast iron and stone. Room had changed physically, but the atmosphere had shifted in the way that atmospheres shift when a room full of powerful people has been forced to update their assumptions simultaneously. The torches still burned their amber smoke. The tiered seats still held their armored occupants. But the quality of attention directed at Diana as she climbed back to the chamber floor had changed from predatory assessment to something more complicated and, in some ways, more dangerous. They were taking her seriously now. Chancellor Martok studied her from his elevated dais with an expression she was learning to read, the controlled neutrality of a man who had survived decades of Klingon politics by never letting a room know what he was actually thinking until he had decided what to do about it. He had watched the arena through a monitoring screen. She suspected. He had seen everything. You could have ended the fight in the first exchange, he said through the translator drone. It wasn't a question. Yes, Diana said. Why didn't you? Because defeating your champion wasn't the point. Proving I could have was. She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. I didn't come here to conquer a room. I came here to be heard. Those are different objectives, and they require different methods. A long silence. Then, from the third tier, the heavy-set woman with the battle-marked armor spoke for the first time. A short, sharp sentence that the drone rendered as, "What does she want from us?" Information, Diana said, addressing the question to the whole chamber rather than just its source. I need to understand this galaxy well enough to determine whether a path home exists, and if not, what my responsibilities are while I remain here. I won't pretend I have no responsibilities. That's not how I was raised. And it's not who I am. If there is something in this empire that requires a warrior's attention, I will not look away from it simply because I arrived by accident. That landed differently in different parts of the room. She could see it. The council members for whom the word warrior had opened a door, and the ones for whom her calm, her precision, her controlled vocabulary had instead raised new categories of suspicion. A warrior who spoke of responsibilities rather than glory. A fighter who controlled a combat rather than finishing it. Something that didn't map neatly onto any template they had prepared. It was the battle-marked woman who moved the room. She descended from the third tier without ceremony and crossed the chamber floor until she stood 10 feet from Diana, examining her, the way a master craftsperson examines something made by an unknown hand, looking for the technique behind the result. Up close, the battle markings on her armor resolved into something extraordinary. Not decorative, but documentary. Each mark corresponded to a specific engagement. Diana had seen similar records on Themysciran ceremonial armor, and the recognition was immediate and mutual, in the way that warriors sometimes recognize each other across every barrier of language and culture. I am Counselor Azet, the woman said through the drone. I have fought in 43 engagements. Across 6 decades of service to this empire, I have seen many things that should not exist. She paused. You are the first of them that chose not to kill when killing was easy. Killing easily is not the same as killing rightly, Diana said. Azet studied her for another long moment. Then she turned back toward the council and spoke, at length, with the authority of someone whose words carried accumulated weight, and the drone translated in fragments that Diana assembled into meaning, unknown origin, verified combat capability, demonstrated restraint, anomalous behavior inconsistent with Federation tactics, worth further examination, potential asset or potential problem, neither conclusion premature. It was, Diana recognized, a speech in her defense, measured, politically careful, framed in terms the council could accept, not an endorsement of Diana's character, but an argument for patience over immediate judgment. It was exactly the kind of speech that required knowing the room well, enough to choose every word like a weapon. The chancellor listened. Several council members who had been visibly hostile settled into something more neutral. Several others, 3, in the upper tiers, seated in a loose cluster whose body language Diana had been tracking since she first entered the room, did not settle. They remained tense in a way that was specifically different from the general tension of a warrior. Culture in the presence of an unknown quantity. They weren't uncertain about her. They were concerned about something else. Diana let her attention rest on those 3 without making her observation obvious. 2 men and 1 woman. all in armor that was slightly finer than their neighbors. Not the chancellor's ceremonial weight, but expensive in the understated way of people who had money old enough not to need display. They sat at calculated distances from each other, the specific distances of people who wanted to appear unassociated while remaining coordinated. She had seen that geometry before in the courts of Themyscira. The plan Azetbur laid out was elegant in the way that the most dangerous plans always were. Simple at its core, complex only in its timing. 3 council members, Councillor Duras the Younger, a name that carried historical weight. Azetbur explained, with the compressed bitterness of someone who had watched a family's treachery repeat across generations. Councillor Kurla, whose public loyalty to Martok was so loudly performed that Azetbur had long suspected it as theater, and Councillor Vekma, the woman in the upper tier whose armor Diana had noted, whose family controlled 3 of the Empire's primary dilithium processing operations and whose financial interests aligned almost perfectly with a Romulan trade arrangement that Martok had blocked twice in open council session. The assassination was scheduled, Azetbur believed, for the remembrance ceremony 2 days away, an empire-wide ritual honoring fallen warriors, during which the chancellor stood exposed in the open plaza of the first city before thousands of citizens and the full council. A ceremonial disruptor salute was traditional. The mathematics of the opportunity were not subtle. 2 days, Diana said. Perhaps less, now that something unexpected has occurred. Azetbur's eyes carried the weight of that implication directly. Your arrival has introduced a variable none of them planned for. They will be accelerating their timeline. Diana stood and moved to the small window set high in the waiting chamber wall, barely a handspan wide, designed for ventilation rather than observation, but enough to show her a slice of the first city skyline. The forged smoke columns, the dark stone towers, the perpetual red-tinged sky of a world that looked like it had been forged in the same fire it worshipped. You need proof, she said. Proof sufficient to bring before the full council and have it accepted. Proof that cannot be dismissed as fabrication, Federation manipulation, or the word of a foreign creature with unknown allegiances. Azetbur said it without cruelty, as a statement of political reality, rather than personal judgment. Yes. Diana turned from the window. The lasso compels truth, she said carefully. Anyone bound by it cannot speak falsehood. But I want to be precise about what that means and what it doesn't mean. It isn't torture. It isn't violation of the mind. It is, she paused, searching for the right framing. It removes the option of lying. The person bound still chooses what to say. They simply cannot choose to make it false. Azetbur considered this with the focused attention of someone running legal and political calculations simultaneously. In Klingon law, a confession made under duress is inadmissible. A confession made willingly before witnesses in the council chamber itself carries the full weight of imperial record. Then we don't extract confessions in private, Diana said. We give them the opportunity to confess publicly, in the chamber, before the chancellor and the full council. She met Azetbur's eyes. And if they refuse to speak truth when given that opportunity, the lasso removes the refusal. You would do this openly, visibly. I won't do it any other way. Another long silence, and then something moved through Azetbur's expression that Diana recognized across every cultural barrier between them. Not relief exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has just found someone willing to share it. Not take it, but share it, which was an entirely different and more honorable thing. There is a problem, Azetbur said. Getting the 3 of them into the chamber before they act requires a reason. A formal council session called outside normal schedule raises immediate suspicion. Any of the 3 could cite illness, duty, emergency. Klingon law allows council members to absent themselves from non-critical sessions. Then it needs to be a session they can't afford to miss, Diana said. Something that directly concerns their interests. She thought for a moment, reaching back through the last several hours, cataloging what she had seen, heard, inferred. The dilithium processing operations, the Romulan trade arrangement blocked twice, the financial architecture of the conspiracy. Call a session to discuss a formal proposal, she said slowly. A trade renegotiation, something that would benefit their financial interests significantly. If passed, something real enough that they'd have genuine reason to attend and vote in favor, something that requires their presence to succeed. She paused. Make it something they want badly. Enough that missing. It is worse than the risk of showing up. Azetber stared at her. You want to use their greed as a summons. I want to use their greed as a door, Diana said. And then I want to walk through it. The next 18 hours moved at the compressed, dangerous pace of a political operation, being run against a clock that was also running against them. Azetber worked the council's administrative channels with the practiced invisibility of decades of institutional knowledge. The proposal materialized in the official session record as a legitimate dilithium trade renegotiation, with enough genuine financial substance that it would hold up to scrutiny. Diana spent the time differently. She walked the first city, not as a prisoner, not as a guest. Azetber had arranged a temporary status that the translator drone rendered as combat verified, foreign national under council observation, which was apparently sufficient to prevent anyone from shooting her on sight, while also making clear she carried no official protection if she wandered into the wrong neighborhood. She accepted those terms and walked anyway, because she had learned a long time ago that you could not make good decisions about a place you hadn't bothered to understand. What she found complicated the simple picture she'd been handed. The first city was not merely a seat of power. It was a living thing, loud, layered, and contradictory, in the way that all genuinely inhabited places were contradictory. Warriors in full ceremonial armor argued passionately outside a public house over something the drone struggled to translate, but that involved deep disagreement about a historical battle's tactical decisions. Children trained in open courtyards under the instruction of elderly veterans who corrected their form with the precise, patient attention of master teachers. Merchants sold food Diana couldn't identify that smelled extraordinary, and artisans repaired armor with the focused care of people who understood that their work stood between the wearer and death. And in the residential districts away from the governmental center, she found something she hadn't expected: quieter lives, families, elderly warriors tending small gardens of dark leaf plants, a young couple arguing outside a doorway with the specific passionate intensity of people who cared enormously about the outcome, a group of older women at a community fire, talking with the settled authority of people whose opinions had been earned over lifetimes, a culture, not a military machine that happened to have civilians attached to it, a culture, ancient and complex and entirely itself, that had developed a warrior's philosophy because it had needed one to survive, and had built everything else: art, family, food, argument, ceremony, memory, inside that philosophy rather than beside it. Diana sat on a stone wall near the community fire for a while and watched and thought about what it meant to have come here by accident and to be preparing to intervene in this empire's internal politics, based on less than 2 days of understanding. The lasso at her hip felt heavier than it usually did. She wasn't questioning the decision. The conspiracy was real. The threat to Martok was real. And innocent people across an empire would pay the price of a Romulan-backed chancellor who had purchased his position with assassination. She had faced similar calculations before and had never been able to convince herself that looking away was a form of virtue. But she was going to do this right, transparently, with the full knowledge of the chancellor, and with the 3 conspirators given every opportunity to speak the truth before she made speaking it unavoidable. That was the line she had drawn for herself, and she would hold it. She returned to the council complex as the red sun touched the black mountains and the forged city lit itself with 1,000 amber flames against the descending dark. Azetber was waiting with confirmation. All 3 had accepted the session summons. The session would convene at dawn. The chancellor was waiting in a private chamber, adjacent to the main hall, a smaller room, surprisingly sparse for someone of his position, with a single long table and chairs built for people who wore a great deal of armor. He had reviewed Azetber's briefing. He looked at Diana across the table with the eyes of a man who had survived 6 assassination attempts by his own count and had developed a very specific relationship with the concept of mortality. You understand, he said through the drone, that if this fails, if what you carry doesn't work as described, or if the council rejects the method, you will have made enemies of three of the most powerful families in the empire. Enemies who will not restrict their response to formal channels. I understand, Diana said, and you're willing to accept that risk. For an empire you arrived in yesterday, for a people you don't know. Diana was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the genuine consideration the question deserved. I know what it costs when the people who could stop a conspiracy choose not to because the risk is personal, she said finally. I've seen what that costs. I won't be one of those people. Not here. Not anywhere. Martok looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, a single, slow inclination of his head that carried the specific weight of a warrior acknowledging another warrior's answer as sufficient. Then we go to the chamber at dawn, he said. Diana nodded and stood. Outside the window, Klingon burned its 1,000 amber lights against the dark. And somewhere in the first city's political architecture, three conspirators were sleeping with plans they believed were still intact. They would learn otherwise in the morning. Dawn on Klingon arrived without gentleness. The red sun hauled itself above the black mountains like something that had fought its way up from below, flooding the first city in a light the color of heated iron. And the forge smoke columns that had burned through the night thinned and shifted in a morning wind that carried the smell of the planet's particular combination of sulfur, metal, and something almost like pine that Diana had noticed in the residential districts and found unexpectedly calming. She had not slept. She rarely needed to, and on the nights before significant confrontations, she found sleep counterproductive anyway. Better to let the mind do its preparation work uninterrupted. She stood at the entrance to the High Council chamber as the first council members arrived, watching the city wake itself below the governmental complex's elevated position, and thought about truth. Not tactically, not strategically, just the thing itself, what it cost, what it was worth, what it did to people when it arrived, in rooms that had been carefully arranged to keep it out. She had carried the lasso of Hestia along, enough to understand that truth was not always clean. It did not arrive like a solution and resolve everything neatly into before and after. Sometimes it arrived like a structural failure, sudden, total, and leaving everyone in the rubble to figure out what came next. Today it would arrive like that. She was ready for the rubble. The chamber filled with the particular controlled energy of a Klingon institutional gathering, loud in specific ways, quiet in others. Every person performing their role in the social architecture of an ancient governmental body while simultaneously running their own private calculations. Diana took her position at the chamber floor, standing rather than seated, which Zetber had advised was both permitted and, in Klingon political terms, a statement of intent that the council would read correctly. Duras the Younger arrived, first of the three conspirators, younger than she'd expected from a Zetber's description, with his family's political history written in the defensive tension he carried in his shoulders, the specific posture of someone who had grown up with a famous name that had already been disgraced once and was trying to restore it through methods that would dishonor it further. He saw Diana standing on the chamber floor, and his composure flickered, just briefly, just a fraction, before he recovered and took his seat with practiced smoothness. Kurla arrived second, the loudly loyal one. He greeted three separate council members with expansive warmth on his way to his seat. His performance of belonging so comprehensive it almost worked. Almost. Diana watched him notice Zetber's position in the chamber, standing rather than seated, near the chancellor's dais, and watched the warmth in his performance cool by precisely the degree that fear cooled it. Vecma arrived last, and she was the most dangerous of the three. Diana had suspected it from the first day, and the intervening hours had confirmed it, not because Vecma showed the most aggression or carried the most overt menace, but because she showed the least. She entered the chamber with the settled calm of someone who had run her probability calculations and remained confident in her outcomes, which meant either she didn't know what was coming or she had contingencies Diana wasn't aware of. Diana kept her attention on Vecma, specifically as chancellor. Martok entered, and the chamber performed its formal acknowledgement, the deep, resonant vocalization she had learned was both greeting and affirmation of authority, and took his position on the dais. The dilithium trade proposal was read into the formal record. Diana watched all three conspirators, listened to it with genuine interest. Underneath their performed neutrality, the financial substance was real, as she and Azetber had ensured, and their interest in it was real, which meant their presence here was motivated by something other than the suspicion that this was a trap. Good. Surprise was a legitimate tactical tool, and she had never been ashamed of using it. The Chancellor allowed the proposal's presentation to complete. Then he set it aside. Before this council votes on the proposal before it, Martok said, his voice carrying the full authority of his office through the chambers. Stone acoustics without any need for amplification. There is a matter of honor to address. A matter that has been brought to my attention by Councillor Azetber and by our guest. He looked at Diana. You have the floor. Every face in the chamber turned toward her. Diana walked to the center of the room, the specific center, the point equidistant from all the tiered seating, the position of maximum visibility, and let the lasso fall from her hip into her hand. The golden rope caught the torchlight and held it, warm and steady, and the chamber reacted to its glow with the instinctive attention that people always gave to things that looked like nothing they had ever seen before. 3 days ago, she said, her voice pitched to carry clearly without force. I fell into this empire from somewhere beyond your galaxy's known boundaries. I have no political allegiance to any faction in your galaxy. I am not a Federation instrument, a Romulan asset, or a representative of any power you have mapped. What I am is a warrior who was raised to believe that when you have the capacity to prevent injustice and choose not to, the choice becomes its own kind of action. She paused. Let that settle. I carry a weapon that compels truth, not through pain, not through violation of the mind, through the simple removal of the option to lie. I am going to ask 3 members of this council to step forward and answer questions about a conspiracy to assassinate Chancellor Martok during the remembrance ceremony. She looked directly at Duras, then Kurla, then Vecma. I am asking you first, voluntarily, publicly, with the full council as witness. If you have nothing to conceal, you have nothing to fear from my rope. The chamber erupted. She had expected it. She stood in the center of it, without moving, without changing her expression or her posture, or the steadiness of the lasso in her hand, and waited for the noise to resolve itself into something workable. The Chancellor did not call for silence. She suspected that was deliberate. Let the chamber spend its immediate reaction. Let the energy dissipate naturally. And then the quiet that followed would be more authoritative than enforced silence. It took approximately 90 seconds. In that 90 seconds, she watched the 3 conspirators perform. Duras went immediately to outrage, standing, gesturing, his voice cutting above the general noise with practiced indignation. Kurla attempted consultation, leaning toward neighboring council members with urgent murmured words, trying to build a coalition of resistance in real time. Vecma did neither. Vecma sat completely still and watched Diana with an expression of focused calculation that confirmed everything Diana had suspected about which of the 3 was actually running this operation. When the chamber quieted, Duras was still standing. This is an insult, he said through the drone's translation. This creature arrives from nowhere, spends 2 days in our empire, and now stands in our council chamber accusing members of this body of conspiracy based on what? The word of Azetber, who has opposed my family's influence for 30 years. The glowing rope of a foreign weapon whose properties cannot be verified. The properties can be verified easily, Diana said. Step forward and let it bind your wrists. Ask yourself a question you know the answer to. Test it yourself, in front of everyone here. If it doesn't work as I've described, you'll have demonstrated that in front of the full council, and I'll have nothing. Silence. Duras did not step forward. The silence of a warrior when honor calls them forward. Azetber said from her position near the dais, her voice carrying the weight of 6 decades of service, is itself a form of testimony. What happened next moved quickly and slowly simultaneously, the way significant moments always did. Kurla broke first, not by stepping forward, but by looking at Vecma. A single involuntary glance of approximately half a second that asked a question and received no answer. and that was witnessed by enough members of the chamber that its meaning was apparent to everyone paying attention. The coalition of three had just become Vecmo alone, because Kurla had just demonstrated that his loyalty to it was conditional on Vecma's support, and Vecma had just declined to provide it. Kurla stood, walked to the chamber floor, held out his wrists. The lasso settled around them with its familiar warmth, and Diana asked her questions quietly, without theater, without cruelty, the same three questions she and Azetbur had identified as sufficient. Did you meet with Romulan intelligence operatives in the past 6 months? Did you discuss the remembrance ceremony in those meetings? Did you agree to act against the Chancellor's life? Yes, yes, yes. The chamber recorded it. The drone translated it. 30 council members heard it in the stone acoustics room where Klingon imperial history had been made for centuries. Duras attempted to run. He made it as far as the chamber doors before two council members who had been positioned there. Azetbur's arrangement, not Diana's, stopped him with the particular efficiency of warriors who had been waiting for exactly this moment and were pleased to have it arrive. Vecma did not run. She stood from her seat and descended to the chamber floor on her own and held out her wrists with the composure of someone who had decided that dignity was the only thing left worth preserving. The lasso settled around her wrists and Diana looked at her directly, the focused, honest attention of one warrior to another, and Vecma looked back with something in her eyes that was not quite remorse and not quite defiance but existed in the complicated territory between them. Did you plan the assassination of Chancellor Martok? Yes, Vecma said. Her voice was steady. Whatever else she was not a coward. Why? The lasso pulsed gently. Vecma's jaw tightened. The specific tension of someone fighting an answer they don't want to give, and then released. Because I believed he was leading this empire toward a Federation dependency that would end us as a people, she said. Because I thought. She stopped. Continued. Because I thought the empire I was trying to save was worth more than the man I was planning to kill. The chamber was completely silent. Diana removed the lasso, stepped back. I know what it is to believe you're protecting something precious, she said quietly, not to the chamber, not for the record, but directly to Vecma. I know what it cost to discover that the method you chose dishonored the thing you were trying to protect. Vecma said nothing, but something moved through her expression, brief, involuntary, human in a way that transcended species. Before her composure reassembled itself, the Chancellor's judgment was swift and formal and final. The three conspirators were remanded to imperial custody, pending full trial under Klingon law. The remembrance ceremony would proceed as scheduled. The dilithium proposal was tabled indefinitely, and Diana of Themyscira stood in the center of the high council chamber of the Klingon Empire as the torches burned there. Amber smoke and the red sun climbed higher outside the stone walls, and felt the particular exhausted clarity that came after a thing had been done correctly rather than easily. Azetbur appeared at her shoulder. The council will want to vote on your status, the counselor said. Formally, what you are, what you're permitted to do here, whether you're an asset or a threat or something the Empire has never had a category for. Diana looked around the chamber at the faces of warriors who were still processing what they had witnessed, recalibrating again, updating their understanding of what was possible in a galaxy that had just expanded considerably. What do you think they'll decide? She asked. Azetbur considered this with her characteristic compressed seriousness. I think, she said, that you deflected a disruptor blast, refused to kill our champion when you could have, walked our streets without contempt, gave our conspirators the chance to confess before you made them, and told Vecma the truth when you could have told her nothing. She paused. I think the council will decide. You are the most Klingon, non-Klingon they have ever encountered. Diana looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, genuine, unguarded, the full warmth of it filling the stone chamber, and Azetbur, after a brief pause, made a sound that the translator drone didn't attempt to render, but that carried the unmistakable shape of laughter in any language. In the end, the High Council voted 14-9 to grant Diana of Themyscira the status of Honored Blade, a designation without precise precedent, pulled from imperial records dating back 4 centuries and applied to foreign warriors who had served Klingon honor without being Klingon. It carried no citizenship, no political power, and no obligation. It carried only recognition, the Empire's formal acknowledgement, that something worthy had stood in its halls. Diana accepted it with the gravity it deserved. She did not know if a path home existed. The dimensional rift that had brought her to QNOS had left no traceable signature, and the Federation's scientific resources, which Martok offered with the particular generosity of a man who understood what he owed, would take time to investigate. Time she would spend here, in a galaxy vast and strange, and full of people building their lives inside. Philosophies she was only beginning to understand. There were worse places to be stranded, and there were worse things to do while stranded than stand. In a room full of warriors who had just learned that truth, wielded with compassion and without cruelty, was the most powerful weapon in any galaxy. The remembrance ceremony came 2 days later. Diana stood in the plaza of the first city among thousands of Klingon citizens as the Empire honored its fallen, and she thought of her own dead, of Steve, of Antiope, of everyone the long century had taken, and found that grief, like honor, needed no translation. The lasso rested warm at her hip, and the red sun burned above QNOS. And somewhere between the stars, a warrior from another world had found, if not a home, then something that rhymed with one.